Good day. For the last couple of hours, there's been a lot less information about news from the battlefronts in Ukraine. As I have discussed many times, that is not necessarily a sign that important things are not happening. On the contrary, it can be a sign that there's a general tightening up of the situation and that the officials, the authorities on both sides, Russian and Ukrainian, are trying to stop information leaking out about actual battlefield events. So we have less information about what's going on, except that one important individual, Denis Bushilin, who is the acting head of the Russian-appointed Donetsk government, has just travelled to Bakhmut, where he's carried out an inspection of the situation himself. And he's been discussing some of what he's seen on various Telegram channels, on his Telegram channel, and I suspect he's going to give an interview, and he's promising that before long he's going to tell us an awful lot more. Anyway, he says a number of things. He says that there's still fighting going on. He talks about fighting going on in the railway station. I'm not sure which railway station. It's clear to me that Bakhmut has several, but apparently there's intense fighting going on for this railway station. He doesn't tell us exactly which structures the Wagner organization has captured in Bakhmut. Yesterday, I got the sort of information that the Wagner organization has captured both the Metallurg Stadium, about that I am reasonably confident, and the Avant-Garde Stadium, about which I'm slightly less confident. And as I said in my program yesterday, that it controls around 90% of the town. I think that is also probably reasonably accurate. And anyway, Pushilin so far hasn't provided information as to exactly what structures have passed under Russian control. But note that the very fact that he's able to travel to Bakhmut at all and apparently visit the place does indicate a certain confidence that the situation there is now confidently moving in Russia's direction. Now, I say that, of course, I do accept and appreciate that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization, regularly goes there, visits the front lines, is often seen with his men in these battlefronts. I have no doubt at all that his physical presence is inspirational to his men, but I don't know of any other commander on either side of the war who does anything similar and who goes so close to the front lines and puts himself at possible risk in that sort of way. And bear in mind that the Ukrainians have made at least one attempt to kill Prigozhin. They launched a missile strike several months ago, as I remember, on a particular location in Donbass, where Prigozhin was supposed to be attending a meeting. In fact, he'd left it some time earlier. Under the structure, the building was destroyed and some people, as I remember, were killed. Prigozhin was not amongst the casualties. Anyway, I've said various things about Prigozhin at various times. I've mentioned the fact that he's not himself the military commander who is in overall charge of the situation on the battlefronts. I said that some of his comments are emotional and perhaps over the top, and on occasion even a little unwise. But I must also acknowledge the other thing, that as I said, he does visit the battlefronts regularly. He is there, seen by his men, and that must have an effect both on their loyalty to him and on their morale. So just to make that very quick point. Anyway, Pushilin has been there. He's has been to Bakhmut. He's toured Bakhmut. He's seen what's going on. He seems very confident about the progress in the town, but he does reiterate that Ukraine is continuing to hold on grimly to their positions in the west of the town. As I said, he's promising us a more detailed update fairly soon. And I'm going to say, actually, that he also talks about the very, very heavy casualties Ukraine is suffering. He talks about Ukraine sending its men to slaughter in Bakhmut. That's become, I'm afraid, something of a trope on the Russian side, which, sad to say, doesn't mean it isn't probably true. There have been suggestions from various Russian officials that Ukrainian losses, and I'm talking here about killed in action in Bakhmut, are somewhere between 10 and 20,000. I'm not going to try and provide any guesstimates myself. I'm nowhere remotely equipped to. But what we do see are now increasing numbers of pictures of this deadly road from Chasov Yar to Bakhmut, the one that passes, well, it's two spurs. One passes through Khromovo, the other passes through Ivanivska. I can't tell you which spur of the road these photos come from, and there are now increasing numbers of them. They are making increasingly disturbing sights. They show piles of destroyed Ukrainian equipment. I'm glad to say that I haven't seen bodies, though I suspect that there have been many people killed on these roads, but it does look as if Ukraine is able to evacuate its dead and wounded from the road. I suspect that brief periods of truce are arranged with the Russians in order to enable that to happen. I know it does take place on other battlefronts in the war, and I assume that this is the case here, though it's possible that Ukraine is still able to evacuate its people under fire. But anyway, judging by the number of vehicles that we see damaged and destroyed along the roads, casualties are indeed very high, and the risks of travelling along these roads must be incredibly high. And we get reports on a fairly regular basis that Ukrainian soldiers have, in effect, rebelled against orders to travel up and down these roads, which, incidentally, as I understand it, now only happens at night. But, of course, some still are sent up these roads. Either they obey orders or are obliged to obey orders. Again, there's all sorts of stories about people being forced to do this. I'm not going to speculate on the truth of that. But certainly it does look as if these casualties are high. And apparently it all very, very much depends on whether there's Russian drones flying over the road with thermal images. If they are, then any Ukrainian movement on the roads is likely to face very rapid destruction. So, a grim picture. And there's now suggestions that, in fact, one of the reasons why the Russians haven't closed the pincers around Bakhmut, and Prigozhin himself has said that there was a discussion about closing the pincers within the Russian military. In other words, closing the pincers in a way that would have created a tight cauldron inside Bakhmut, but the decision was taken not to do so. I've speculated that that was probably done in order to avoid heavier Russian casualties, given the intense Ukrainian resistance against closing the pincers that would have provoked, and also perhaps was intended to end the Battle of Bakhmut faster by giving Ukraine some opportunity to retreat, the Russian priority now being to wrap up the battle as soon as possible. Anyway, regardless of that, Prigozhin has said that there was a debate about closing the pincers and that the Russians had the means to do it, but chose not to for whatever reason. And there is now speculation that the one key reason is that the Russians have calculated that since Ukraine continues to send men and supplies, or try to send men and supplies into Bakhmut between these pincers, it actually is more economical to destroy these men and these supplies as they go to Bakhmut, and it kills and destroys more Ukrainian soldiers and more equipment than it would have been the case if the pincers themselves had closed. It also appears, there's also reports that, of course, Ukrainian troops are sometimes withdrawn from Bakhmut. There's talk about continued attempts by Ukraine to rotate exhausted and battered units out of Bakhmut and replace them with fresher ones, that when these units, these exhausted units, try to retreat from Bakhmut, they too risk being caught in the crossfire of the Russian guns. There's a very brutal calculus, a very cruel calculus. I can't obviously speculate, and I've no means to. I mean, even if I had the degree of military knowledge, I doubt that anybody who isn't directly informed about the situation on the ground would have any means to say whether these speculations about the Russian decision not to close the pincers are correct. But even if they're not, well, one gets a sense of the overall tragedy. I would say the disaster in this town, human disaster, and of course in some respects military disaster for Ukraine. And I gather that there's more complaints about this in Ukraine itself, and no doubt we'll be hearing more when Bakhmut falls, as it certainly will. It's now, I think, becoming increasingly clear that there's not going to be a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut anytime soon, certainly not before the end of April, and it's doubtful, it seems to me, that the fighting in Bakhmut is going to continue that long. But anyway, one way or the other, we are looking at a very grim picture in Bakhmut indeed. Now, there's been more fighting in other places. There's lots of information, which again I find very difficult to assess or understand, about Russian advances near Avdiivka. As I said, my own guess is that when Bakhmut falls, the Russian priorities will be to capture Chasov Yar and perhaps Konstantinovka, two smallish, well, Chasov Yar is basically a village. Ukrainian soldiers have said it's virtually undefendable. Konstantinovka is a rather bigger place, but apparently significantly smaller than Bakhmut. Anyway, that the Russians will want to capture these places: Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, Bogdanovka, closer to Bakhmut, where fighting is said to be ongoing, Orekhovo, Vasilyevka. They'll want, in other words, straighten out the line around Bakhmut in preparation for further advances, and no doubt to establish their own defensive positions, in other words, to consolidate. But alongside that, I think the priority will be to capture Seversk to the north and Avdiivka to the south. And once the Russians have done that, they will be significantly closer once they've weathered the storm of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Assume, of course, that they do weather the storm of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They will be in a position to advance west towards the Dnieper, bringing themselves ultimately opposite the key town of Dnipro, which, by the way, if it happens, will, in my opinion, mean the effective end of the war. I think if the Russians reach the east bank of the Dnieper across from Dnipro, then essentially the war is ended. I think that at that point, Ukraine will be in a crisis situation from which I can't myself see that there would be any real prospect of recovery. Now, that does leave unresolved the bitter fighting that's going on in Marinka and Vuhledar. And I have to say about Marinka, I've discussed the reliability of Russian reports from time to time. About Marinka, I'm going to say it straightforwardly. Russian reports have often been very unreliable. They, at one point, a couple of months ago, they were claiming that Marinka had been captured, that the Russians had broken into the center of the town and then captured the town itself. It's clear that was never the case, or even remotely the case, that the Ukrainians were putting up a determined resistance in Marinka, and that at the time when some of those claims about Marinka having been captured were being made, in fact, Ukraine was still holding positions still in the central areas of this town. But anyway, it does seem over the last few days that some kind of progress has been made in Marinka. Pushilin said a short time ago that Ukraine only holds a small part of Marinka, and there's been reports that a tire factory there has now been captured by the Russians, one of these other big industrial facilities, and that might open the way, perhaps, for a further Russian advance on in Marinka, and perhaps the final resolution of this very long battle. There have been many people, by the way, who, whenever I discuss Bakhmut, come back and say, well, it hasn't been very impressive. The Russians have taken so long to capture this small isolated town of Bakhmut, which has no strategic significance, and this doesn't really show the Russian military in very good light. I have repeatedly said that I don't agree. I think the prolongation of the Battle of Bakhmut has worked to the Russian advantage, not to the Ukrainian. On the contrary, I think Ukraine's overinvestment in the defense of Bakhmut has been disastrous, and the United States thinks so, apparently. So do many officials in Europe, military officials in Europe, and certainly that's my view. But if you wanted to make that criticism, if you wanted to make criticism that the Russians have made heavy weather of one particular place, then the right place to do it is not Bakhmut, where I think the Russian operations, spearheaded by the Wagner organization, so far as I can judge, and remember I'm no expert in these things, have been incremental, methodical, and very effective. If you wanted to make that kind of criticism, then the right place to do it is in Marinka. Now, I say that I don't know very much about the nature of the battle in Marinka, but certainly it's been the case that the Russians have given an over-optimistic spin repeatedly of their progress in that particular town, and they have made very heavy weather of it. But anyway, supposedly, and again, in light of these premature claims of victory in the past, I take this now with a cascade of salt, a mountain of salt. But anyway, we're getting reports that this tire factory has now been captured, and that it does seem as if these reports are true, and I expect that they are about the tire factory at least, that the Battle of Marinka, this long, slow, grinding battle, is finally coming to some kind of conclusion. In and around Vuhledar, a more difficult place, a very difficult place to capture by all accounts. Apparently there's been a lot of fighting backwards and forwards. Ukraine has launched several counterattacks on Russian positions. They've been repelled. The Russians supposedly are incrementally working to advance around Vuhledar. But the key point to make is that the Russian Air Force is now definitely operating actively around Vuhledar. This is now widely confirmed, and it seems clear that the battle for Vuhledar, with Russian aviation now working, that might start to take a different turn again in a short while, perhaps after Bakhmut falls. I am going to say one further point about Vuhledar. Vuhledar and Marinka, one of the reasons why Ukraine has probably clung on to these places so determinedly, and with some effect, is because if the Russians do capture these two places, it will, if my understanding of the geography is correct and of the transport, the railway networks is correct, if that does indeed happen, then of course the entire project of a Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye region would be put in question. And now that brings me both to the question of the Ukrainian counteroffensive and to this big document dump. Now, I've made it clear in previous videos that I believe these documents